Well, thank you. First thing I would like to do is like to thank you for joining me and thank you for taking this opportunity. It's a blessing to me. Like I said, one of the reasons why I wanted to interview you is I have this question out there that I'm posing to dads, and I think you might have a unique take being a pastor at his Providence church, the lead pastor, correct?
Correct.
So obviously that probably entails a lot more pressure as being a dad and a example than just probably most dads that aren't in front of a bunch of people saying, hey, we need to live a certain lifestyle, and then doing that on a day in, day out basis. So I guess my first question that I've asked everybody is, do you think America would be in the situation it is in if there was less fatherless homes and more active dads in their kids' lives?
Absolutely not. I don't think we would be in the state we're in. I think, in fact, I would say an overwhelming majority of issues can and should be traced back to the absentee father, or the struggling father, or the addicted father, or the broken father, or the abusive father, or the non-existent father. Yeah.
Yeah. So going in that route, let's start it off, because I like to lead with that, and then we'll talk about your experience with fatherhood and all the struggles and the good things that come out of it, and obviously the hard things. And then what I would like to do is I like to read some statistics and then maybe re-ask that question again. And the reason why I like to re-ask that question is everyone you ask that question to that I just posed, the answer comes off, yes, definitely. And I think for a lot of people, it's known, but it's not felt or known. You know what I mean? And until we internalize that and realize that as dads, we have an obligation for our kids, but also to be examples for other kids, whether, it's if there's a kid doing something, correcting them, or just showing this is what a dad should be like, so they can have something to benchmark in the future. So let's get to some fun questions and stuff like that. So for you, how is it to be a dad in a nutshell? What does that mean to you?
I've loved it. It's awesome. I'm probably trying to overcompensate for some dad things in my own fatherhood, and that probably also needs addressing. But I think overall, it's just been the most incredible gift.
Yeah, I heard what you said about overcompensating. I think a lot of dads do that, right? Like a lot of good dads who are active and involved want to give their kids things and maybe also live a little bit of their lives that they didn't live when they were younger or whatever. So
yeah, well, I mean, the best example I can think of is growing up, I always wanted this epic treehouse.
Yeah.
And I mean, I really I envisioned it. I would sketch it out. I drew it, and had all these plans for this world-class treehouse. And growing up, my parents were divorced. My dad struggled with a lot of stuff, and it never panned out for me to have that treehouse. I would kind of make stuff out of garbage and whatever pallets I could drag home on my bike. And so over COVID, I made it my project, and I built this epic treehouse, overcompensating.
Yes.
So that my kids don't go without the way that I did.
Yeah.
And then it's they were never really that interested in a treehouse. It was me. So when I think of overcompensating, I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna now make this treehouse that I should probably be paying taxes on. It's so big.
You're gonna rent it out.
I know. So in fact, people have come along and said, you should Airbnb this. We would rent. We'd pay to stay here. So.
Oh yeah.
But anyway, yeah. So those are the types of things I'm gonna make sure that my kids have what I didn't have.
Yeah.
And it's maybe they didn't really need it.
Well, that's the thing is we have all this video equipment out, and I asked my kids, I'm like, hey, do you want to learn it? And they're no. And I was like, when I was growing up, I would die to do this, right? So I think that's maybe a thing us fathers have to deal with is we want to give things, and sometimes we want to give them what we want to give them, not what they want, and trying to find what they want. And again, sometimes they don't know. Sometimes as a dad, you have to force them into things for them to realize it. So
sure.
All right. So what is the best part of being a dad?
Not to over spiritualize everything, because I know, as a pastor, everybody's expecting that. But I do feel like seeing kids and being sort of, I'll say, responsible for their encounter with the Lord, and
Sure.
seeing things click, like when they get it, and they're putting pieces together, and the fact that you can be a part of that, it's like this immense responsibility. But it's also the responsibility, risk, and reward. It's all proportionate. So the reward of doing it right and seeing it is just incredible. It's to me, that's like kind of what I live for. When
Yeah.
it comes to my kids, and everything's towards this idea of like, whoa, we're building something here. Dads are builders,
Yes.
right? And so when you think of it in terms of you're building a person, I'm building 4. It's like you see the pieces click into place, and their eyes light up, and they're like, whoa, like they understand a truth or a principle, something valuable that they'll carry the rest of their life.
Well, I talked to a lot of men about this already, and you're the first person that said it, and I always thought I was alone in it, because very similar. I lie in bed awake at night sometimes thinking, like, how am I going to challenge my kid? How am I going to make my kids have a good foundation, be kind people, be good people, be good examples for everybody? And you sit there, and sometimes, I'm sure you see this too, sometimes when you see them not doing the things and you're like, are they not getting this? Like, how
Right.
many different ways can I say this, right? And then in those moments, those little peaks that God gives you every once in a while, where they, for example, Cole was coming to a youth group here,
Yeah.
right? And I dropped him off, and there was a car in front of us, and he gets out and he sees his buddy inside the door, so he just starts running towards the door, right? Well, as he's running towards the door, he sees this girl get out of the car, and he's running to the door, gets to the door, and holds it for her. And she's a good 30, 40 feet away from him,
Yes.
and he just didn't wait.
That's a win.
It is a win.
That's
It
a
is,
win.
and you're like, I guess we're doing something right every once in a while to see those things. And again, I also tell a lot of dads, I go, here's the problem. You could do everything right, whatever everything right means. I go, but eventually they get in the world. And sometimes, like with the prodigal son and all those other things, you get caught up with the wrong people. So my prayer is always that the things you needed to do, that you ask God to always watch, because we pray every day, watch over them, guide them, protect them. You pray that sticks.
Yeah.
And if they do turn out not the way you wanted, or not the way you envision, right? I think a lot of dads have these visions, like you said, of what their sons or daughters could be, but that they come back to God.
Yeah.
And that they're happy. I tell my kids, I'm like, I don't care if you're successful. My success for you is making enough money to support your family and be happy.
Yeah.
That's
Absolutely.
it. That's it. Serve God, be happy,
Absolutely.
be a thing. So now that we know kind of the good part, what is the hardest part?
Oh my gosh. Do you have how many?
Yeah.
How much
We got
time do you
5
have?
hours.
Yeah.
We have 5 hours.
Yeah. I think the hardest part is living in the constant context of this culture.
Yes.
And realizing that it is literally impossible to really protect your kids from it. I'm not a fearful person. In fact, I probably could. It'd be useful to be a little more afraid of a few things.
Yes.
But I'm not. I've never been afraid of like really anything. I feel like, and I know I can say that to you, and you understand with your history and what you've achieved. And so I think of it, and I'm like, I look at my kids, and I look at the world, and I'm like, how in the world are we gonna really not only build in our kids what we want to see, but also protect them or insulate them or create buffers around them from the inevitable?
Yes.
And so I think it's unrealistic, and even if you could make it a reality, it's unsustainable. So however you want to paint that picture, however you want to write that story. I mean, I know you could live in so much fear that you just move your kids into a bomb shelter, or you move them into a cabin in like northern Canadian unnamed territories, or whatever you got to do. But at the end of the day, that's not really what builds the character you're looking for. The character that we're looking for is the character that remains in the face of the opposition, in the face of the tide that's working against it. And so I think the hardest thing is, how do you build something that stands? How do you build something that can withstand the elements of culture?
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because being politically active in the last year, and also being in the military, and growing up in a church and seeing all these different types of attacks, and figuring out where you're going. And we've had this discussion before where, a lot of times people come to you and like, I'm fearful, or this is happening, and I'm like, I just trust God, so I don't have that. And I go, it's really weird.
Yeah.
But I think what happens, I also know I have to do something. That's one of my key phrases I tell people: do something, right? My mother, she's gonna get mad. My mother's very accepting, and she's like, you can't do things, you can't fight back. And I'm like, to me, that's not right. To me, I'm going to push back. I'm going to set the example like you. I'm going to do the things that I can do. And again, I might be, swimming against the tide all the time. But my hope is when people look back, and especially my kids look back, they can say, listen, when things got tough, my dad did something.
Right.
And I think that's something that your children will be able to say, just because the nature of what you do. You're helping people out. You're bringing them to the Lord. You're in these challenging times. One thing I love about your church is you're building institutions. You're building other things. Like if the world has it and it's not going right, this church, like, how can we do it better? How can we instill these values? So I get what you're saying, right? It seems like a losing battle, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I like working with other men like yourself, and seeing other men actually, like, even if it looks impossible, like, we got God on our side. What's impossible,
That's it.
right? And that's why I tell my mom, because my mom's one of these things, the world's going to end in 2 years. This prophetic word on YouTube 2 years ago, it was going to happen. And I'm like, well, we're not going to know the time. And I said, if it is, it is. But until that day, I'm going to do my best. And I'm not going to give up. And I think if we instill those values and more in our kids, and then other kids and people learn, I think the world would be a little better. That's how we kind of push back or whatever. But it's funny you talked about that, because my next question is, do you feel like there's an attack on manhood and fatherhood?
I mean, I wish I could say that it still felt like an attack, but it's like almost like it was a war that we already lost.
Yeah.
Because there's a remnant, of men, like the Bible says there will be a remnant, but it feels like society has just given up on, the real role of a man.
Yes.
And so yes, to answer your question, yes, at least.
Yes.
At least an attack.
At least an attack. It's when I had this discussion with the other men I had in there, a lot of it said social media, which is true. But my son helped me out. One of my sons helped me out with the video and audio, and when we were done, because he kind of made him do it, I said, what do you think? And he's like, a lot of people need to hear this. And I think one of the attacks and one of the good things they've done, and you mentioned the whole pandemic, one of the good things they do is they isolate people.
Yeah.
And I think what happens is a lot of men now feel isolated. But the good thing about men is if you get a bunch of them in a room and you start talking about things, they'll be honest. They really are. They'll say things you don't like hey, you're fat, you need to lose weight or something like that. Like, we're not going to sit there like, oh, you're handsome. No, we'll tell you how it is. And in the other discussion I had with those men, like I said, once they started realizing they could be honest, which that was the ground rules, they really became honest, and they really saw the power in men talking to men, and men mentoring and learning from each other. And those are one of those things I think that if people did that more, and this is why I love the church. I was telling some of the people that were here, some of the men, when I was discussing what I was talking about, churches do a pretty good job of that on a whole. A lot of people that come to church at one point have been broken, maybe some haven't. Like, I grew up in a church. I don't ever feel like I was in this broken place, but you were brought up in a community where you support each other, you help each other. When people are down, you bring each other up. So I think there's that support group in there. Outside of that church environment, I think a lot of men don't know how to do that because they see it as failure.
Sure.
And one of the big things that it was funny is a lot of guys talked about the times you screw up. I mean, we're human, we screw up all the time. But the intention is, even with those screw ups, to persevere and help raise your child to be respectable, to be a good, solid citizen, to be, I always say this, I want my kids to be better than I am. I tell them they have a tall task. I want you to be better than me.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you the tools. I'm going to give you the cheat codes. Be better.
Yeah.
Raise your kids better. And I think if society did that, if men knew how to reach out to other men, if they discuss, and again, this is outside the church, because I know in the churches, there's organizations, especially that you have, that there's those men's groups that strengthen men strengthening men. But if we could do that more, just as a society, and we didn't have these attacks on men, I think it would be better. So that leads me to, if you don't mind, I'm just going to go through some statistics for you.
Sure.
Because I think what happens is, we know fatherless homes have an impact. And I think you probably know some of these statistics or whatever, but to hear them is shocking. And when I tell this to other fathers, I think what it does is it actually solidifies that, holy cow, I probably need to do a better job, or I probably need to look at myself and say, am I doing enough? So there's pages. I got pages. So it's going to be a couple minutes. So
yeah.
All right. So 63% of youth suicides come from fatherless homes. Almost 3/4 of American children living in fatherless families will experience poverty before age 11. A 1987 study found that 60% of rapists were raised in fatherless homes. 73% of fatherless children say their school grades are worse than others in their class. Here's some good news. There wasn't a lot of good news in these statistics. Here's the good news. Since 2016, the percentage of African American children living with a single mother has decreased by 6%.
All right.
And I think that community, and again, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think they're starting to realize, you can see it even on YouTube, who influencers, a lot of African American males are calling for fatherhood and to reverse this. So I'm hoping that's a trend, because we need that to happen across the board for everybody.
Amen.
So 1 in 4 children live without a father in their home. 11% of American children live with their mothers only. And that was in 1968, 11%. By 2020, it is increased to 21%. 30% of both single fathers and absent fathers are never married. Children raised by a single father are significantly more likely to use marijuana than children raised by a single mother. Academic performance varies between children with present fathers and children with absent fathers. Makes sense, right? So here's some statistics with children with present fathers, and I'm going to give you it with absent fathers. So if you had a father present, 24% repeated grade in school. 30% reported their grades were better than others in their class, and 3.6% reported that their grades were worse than others. So that's with a dad in there, right? Doesn't seem like good statistics. Children with absent fathers, 50% had to repeat a grade in school. 22% reported their grades were better than others, so down, and 73%, as I said earlier, reported their grades were worse. Absent fathers, here's a study, absent fathers may be a significantly underlying cause of drug use, crime, and poverty for males. Makes sense, right? Children without fathers are 10 times more likely to abuse chemical substances. 71% of all adolescent substance abusers came from fatherless homes. 80% of all prison inmates come from fatherless homes. Children from fatherless homes are 11 times more likely to exhibit violent behavior. And that's an interesting one for me. And I know I want to go through these quick, but that's an interesting one, because I think what happens is they talk about toxic masculinity, and dad that he's authoritarian and disciplinarians, and like they beat their kids or do stuff, you're not supposed to do that. But I think what happens is when dad corrects their children and shows them the way to deal with their emotions and stuff, maybe that's why, you're 11 times less likely if you had a dad that sat there and corrected you instead of allowing you just to react and do what you want to do.
Sure.
Children raised without a father are 20 times more likely to be incarcerated. Children from fatherless homes are 14 times more likely to commit rape. Fatherless children make up 90% of all homeless and runaway children. Kids with absent fathers are 32 times more likely to run away from home. Having a social father, one who just like, this is your dad, even though he's not your dad, are at an increased risk of abuse and neglect. Children from fatherless homes are 9 times more likely to be sexually abused or raped. Kids with absent fathers are 5 times more likely to commit suicide. One study found that an absent father can cause male adolescents to experience resentment, anger, financial issues, and stress. Obviously, this one's true. Fatherless sons who lack discipline are often disrespectful to authority and rebellious. Children without fathers are more likely to score below average in math and reading, and they're 9 times more likely to drop out of school. Fatherless children are less likely to earn professional academic qualifications as adults. Of all teen pregnancies, 70% happen in fatherless homes. And since 1960s, out-of-wedlock births and divorce have been a major cause of fatherless homes. And in 1980, 18.4% of all births were unmarried women. That is up to 40.5% by 2020. So when I read these statistics and when I read these to a lot of the other dads I talked to, I think what happens is, when I asked the question, do you think if there were more dads involved and there was less fatherless homes, the answer usually is, oh yeah, that makes sense. But when you see the impact of what's going on, it just, to me, it really hits home to that, like, how do I do better? What else can I do? Like I sit there and I used to tell people, like, listen, my job is to raise my kids to be the best kids they can. And then, like I said, as I grew older, as I was in the military and realized that you're held to a different standard at all the times, kind of like yourself, you're like, hey, listen, I have to be example for everybody. So I don't know if you could speak to a little bit about those stats.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot. It's a lot of information, and I think it just is a resonating indicator of the climate. I think it's important to note in the midst of that fatherless is not limited to a house in which a biological man that shares your DNA exists.
Correct.
I know homes that the literal dad lives there, but there's no fathering going on.
Yes.
And I think that to the outside, somebody may see a family that looks like they should be on the cover of a magazine. They're the epitome poster child family, but there's no fathering going on.
Yes.
This is a bigger problem than I think a lot of like white middle class suburban people hear those statistics and they think, the ghettos, they think the Section 8, they think the stereotypical, fatherlessness, but it's a heart thing, Justin, and we see it in the Word of God when we're told that in these sort of like last days, the outpouring of the Lord and what revival looks like and what a move of God looks like right now. And it's described this way, that the hearts of the fathers will be returned to the sons and the hearts of the sons will be returned to the fathers. And, from an absentee father perspective, you can say, well, that means the dad that left is going to come home. But from our perspective, where we see a lot of families that do stay together in a little literal, physical, domestic sense, the heart might not be there. I mean, think of marriages, right? I know we're talking about fatherhood here, but there's a lot of marriages that are on paper, legally, on a filing cabinet somewhere, they're still married, but their hearts are not in it.
Yes.
Well, the same thing can be true. There can be a kid living in a bedroom down the hall from your bedroom, and it doesn't mean that your heart is in the fathering of that child. And so to me, when I hear those things, I'm thinking of, okay, a lot of that, how we're defining fatherlessness. But what if we really went after the heart, which would be impossible to measure,
Yeah.
without the Lord? Those numbers would be astronomically even worse than they are. And so to me, it has to start in the heart.
Yes.
It can't start by just like injecting men back into these places, because we're just going to bring all our toxic stuff with us. We need not just fathers, we need healthy fathers. We need fathers who are whole, who have done whatever work is required to receive whatever healing they need. We need men who are taking responsibility for their brokenness. Because otherwise the adage, hurt people hurt people. Well, hurt fathers hurt children.
Yes.
And that doesn't mean that they're physically abusive or even verbally abusive. Sometimes the worst damage that we can do is like to not be there, to not be there. And I think that just taking inventory of ourselves, and you know what? Yeah, I can check a bunch of boxes as a dad. I'm providing for my family. I'm at a lot of the basketball games, as many, as I can be at, or I do the school functions and the whatever. I can say all that stuff. But if I'm really real with myself and take inventory, like there are places that I would say, yeah, I haven't been as present in that context. I haven't, like, I'm a big advocate of kids hearing about sex the first time from their parents.
Oh yeah, me too.
And specifically, for my sons are my two oldest, and then the two daughters that we'll figure that out when they get there. They're little right now, but my two sons, it was so important to me that, last summer Finn was 12 and we did the whole talk, and we went for a drive and we got lunch and we did the whole thing. And I was adamant that my kids are going to hear about this from me first. Because what I don't want is to raise them saying prayers at night and coming to church every Sunday and going to a Christian school and having healthy food and wearing like appropriate clothing, and to leave out this like epic facet of who they are as human beings and how to steward the gift of sexuality. But that's a place where a really good dad can ignorantly be absent.
Yes.
And there it is, absentee fatherhood in the area that is absolutely crucial, because guess what? If we're not telling our kids about sex, the whole rest of the world will do it for us. And every TV show they watch will do it for you. Public education will do it for you. Every commercial between the show, like, will do it for you. So I think that, there are other areas, like, you talked about respect and honor. I know some really great fathers who are doing it like really well. They're providing, they're making sure that all these boxes are checked, but they're being totally disrespected, and maybe not just by their kids, maybe by their wives too. And so what's happening is there's an absentee aspect of fatherhood in the area of generating and really breathing life into that area of honor in their kids' lives. So yeah, that probably didn't really answer your question.
No,
Sorry.
you brought up a lot of things, because I come from a divorced family. I had a stepdad. He was, as you said, hurt people. His dad left him when he was young. We moved to Germany, and he was a stepdad. And he would always say to my mother, "Hey, listen, I don't know how to raise kids." And that kind of hurt. I didn't get a lot of things, but when he passed, and it was something that you said, when he passed, I had to look at it different. I'm like, I was a step kid, but he provided a roof over my head. He provided food, and outside of a couple of times where I was really bad and I got expelled and he beat me, right? And that was the last time he ever touched me too, because he told my mother I would never touch that kid again. You know what I mean? He provided. And when I look back on it, I'm like, I'm blessed because he did that.
Sure.
Right? Because there's a bunch of things that could have happened. I could have been, sexually abused. I could have starved. There's a lot of things. You could have beat my mother or stuff like that. It could have been bad. So was it everything I wanted as a child? No. But I also learned to respect that sometimes, a dad that just goes out and you work construction and you beat your body all day and you come home and you're like, I'm beat. And I'm like, maybe. And I think what happened, those little stories you get every once in a while, about the pain that they feel, because I think some dads out there want to do stuff, they're just broken or don't know how to do it. So it is to what you said is, yeah, fatherless homes and even homes with fathers who are absent or don't know how to connect. And again, like you said, you would hope that all these things you do, you're doing stuff. And I think you and I are probably more alike. I sit up at night, as I said earlier, and I think, what am I doing? How am I reaching this kid? How do I change it? How do I do it different? And sometimes the things you think you're doing right, you're not. I think a lot of dads learn certain traits or skills, and they said, this worked for me, it's going to work for them. And I think maybe part of it too is understanding. And I think that's what I pray for a lot. I get in arguments with my mother because I told her once, I go, kids have their personality. There's only so much you're going to do. I mean, at a young age, you can influence some things, and throughout their lives, you can hopefully course correct enough. But their personalities are their personalities. And she'd be like, you're wrong. And I'm like, well, how come my two brothers are wildly different people living under the same rules that I lived under?
Right.
So I think knowing that and having these discussions with other dads too helps too, to say, listen, what might work for one child isn't going to work for another child. And if you're going to be a dad and you want to be a good dad, I think a lot of guys want to be good dads and they think they're good dads, but maybe one of the things is, and again, this is what I like about church, right? Like a lot of people like, oh, I got to go to church. I like church because it's a constant reminder that
that you're not in it alone.
You're not in it alone, right? And you could probably always be better. Right? Like that struggle to try being better, to do better, to see things differently. I think it's good. I think a lot of people don't like that. I think a lot of people think it's a smack in the face when they're like, oh, you're saying I have to do this, or you point out something that they could correct.
Yeah.
And I always tell my kids, I said, I'm going to tell you something, you probably won't understand it till you're older. And I tell this to them all the time. I'm like, the people that are willing to put their friendship on the line with you, to be honest, those are the best friends. And we have too many people that are just going to go along to get along and don't care if you succeed or if you do the right things. And they're like, oh, you're doing great.
Yeah.
I go, it's the people that are willing to step out and say, you're messing up, you need to fix it. Or you need to think about this. I go, those are the people that care. I go, so when you're sitting here getting mad at your dad, or getting mad at your mother, or getting mad at a friend because they're trying to help you out, you're going to realize that those are the people that actually love you, because they're willing to step out, take heat, take pain, take hurt.
Yeah.
So you're a better person. And I think, again, that's why, like I said, I love this church. I think I've always learned from church. I grew up in the church basically since probably 7. And to have many examples of men who were broken, men who have tried being better, men who've done stuff, and even women too, and families and stuff, and to see the build and the constant struggle, I think it solidified in me that, listen, I'm nowhere next to perfect. I'm always going to keep trying. And it was funny in the other discussion that we had with the other guys, one of them said, listen, I'm always a dad. I'm a grandfather. I'm 70-something years old. Those are my kids. They will never not be my kids. And I always have a right to say what I want to say.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I sit there now as my kids get older and I'm like, oh, our relationship's going to change. You're becoming an adult. And I want it to be that way. But I also have to say, I'm your dad. And if anyone's going to be there for you, it's going to be me.
Right.
And your mother, obviously. But, I'm talking to them. And you're not going to like it a lot of times.
Right. No, it's true. I think there's a reconciliation that we have a really hard time with. It's this marriage between, the correcting, which the ditch on that side of the road becomes abusive, right? When we're just nitpicking and exasperating and we're just calling out everything you're doing wrong. But the Lord says, I discipline the ones I love. I chastise, I scold, I rebuke my sons, in a very different way than I would my servants or my slaves. And so that love, that desire to see those grow up in truth, in the full potential of what they're capable of, it requires that kind of thing. And to me, the other side of that helps to sort of counterbalance the having to call out those things is really calling out, and I'll say in faith, what you know your child is capable of. And this works for everybody. This works for dads on dads, like when we're in a group of men, it works with our wives, and any wives watching this, it works with your husbands.
Yes.
We will live up to the expectations that are put on us. We will live up to the names that we're called. And we've done so much marriage counseling here over the years. And in premarital counseling, one of the things I always include is to each other, like, hey, if you call your wife a nag, she will be a nag. If you call her a queen, she will be a queen. If you honor your husband and you call him, the father, and the husband, you respect him, he will raise the standard himself and live up to that. If you call him a dog, he'll live up to that too. And so I think when we see our kids, it can be maybe if we were criticized and that was the method with which we were raised, it can be easy. Our human nature wants to go to critical, observation, and not constructive criticism, but destructive criticism. And then we wonder why, when we're calling our kids all these things and when we're constantly pointing out to them who they are in terms of their failures, why are those failures so consistent? Because they're living up to our expectation. And our expectation isn't, why can't you be this? It's what we're calling them.
Yes.
I think it's important that we differentiate that. But when we start to, and the Bible says, well, part of this walk of faith is speaking things that aren't as though they were. So if you know that your daughter or your son is capable of a thing, or capable of rising above a certain behavior or a certain pattern or whatever that they seem to be stuck in, if you know that they're capable of that, or even if you want to know it, I would encourage fathers to start to speak it, call it out in them. Like, call them that thing, call them that leader that you want them to be, even when they're not. And you know what? There's something, God wires us this way to receive from our fathers like this. When we start to help our kids identify with not just who they are, but who they can be, they will grow into that pretty quickly. We'll be amazed, and it'll save them a lot of time and a lot of therapy bills. To just say, wait a minute, I can be this. Why? Because my dad sees this in me.
Yes.
And even if they can't verbalize that, or we're not processing that to the level of saying that statement and making that connection, neurologically, psychologically, spiritually, we are what our Father calls us. We take our Father's last names, but we also take every name our Father calls us along the way. So there's a lot of power in that.
What's funny is my daughter, when she was younger, I had to go to a school board meeting because she was born in October. She was 3 years old, mind you, and she was going to preschool. And unbeknownst to us, they tested her because she was spelling words that the teachers couldn't spell. I was a stay-at-home dad. I'm like, I'm going to teach my kids to read, do math, all this other stuff. So they called us in, and they were like, hey, we tested your daughter. She's at a second grade level.
Wow.
At 3.
My goodness.
So I'm like, all right, cool. So she'll just stay with these kids. I didn't want to have her skip a grade. I just wanted her to stay with the kids. And like, oh, no. We're going to hold her back a year. I'm like, in what world does this make sense? Right? Like, this doesn't make sense. So I had to go in front of the school committee. And one of the things is kind of what you said. And I told them this because it just popped into my head. And it kind of what you said. Everyone says the boats rise with the tide. And you kind of hinted that. Like, everything rises, we can rise them. And I said, but one thing you forget, and everyone always forgets, is the boats sink with the tide too.
Yes.
Right? And I go, that's what you're doing. You're sitting there looking at my daughter, and you're saying emotionally she won't be ready or something like that, whatever. So because of her emotions, which you don't know, right? You're willing to keep her back and hold her down.
Right.
I said, I'm not willing to do that.
Right.
And I think it's a key to a lot of people. We always see this side, but we never understand the kind of what you said is if you start saying all these derogatory things or keeping the bar low for your kids, they'll achieve the low.
Yeah. And I think, some of those statistics talk about, kids from fatherless homes sort of reproducing, toxic or negligent environments. And, we call our daughters, princesses. And,
Yes.
I think we're also giving them the keys to a healthy relationship for themselves. Part of the reason why teen pregnancies are so high is because there isn't that expectation of the significance of a father. Well, I only saw my mom raise me without a man, so why would I think to do it any other way? And when we're loving our wives well, and we're raising our daughters as princesses, they will only gravitate towards a husband that will treat them at least as good as their dads did.
Yes.
So when we set the bar really low, like why would our daughters end up with decent men, decent human beings for husbands? But when we say no one will love you as good as I am, now they have a job. Now they have a job, and it's to find a man who can even come close. And that's my goal is to, when it comes to our daughters, to really treat them, and also each other's daughters, like love each other's sons and daughters in the same way, so that you're just reiterating, you're just compounding the truth that hopefully their own father is speaking into them.
Yes.
And that this is not maybe on topic because you're talking about, community of dads, but I do think that there's really something powerful about children that grow up in a community of faith, a church community of believers, whatever that is, a Christian school where they're exposed to a new norm, where it's not just their dad is the odd one out and all the other dads are like, yeah, you can have the keys, you can stay the night at your boyfriend's house, you can drink, at 14 years old, whatever. It's like there's a norm. You're creating a whole environment.
Yes.
Not just a microcosm. You're working those parameters outward to say, no, it may take a little more work, but there are other families with values like ours. There are other people, there are other dads who have kids who are your age who also share, our worldview and our, system of truth and everything we stand on. And so the broader that we're painting that picture for our kids of like, hey, this isn't just our little house and we're the only ones in the world that are doing this right. That's not realistic either.
Yes.
So we have to create space for, hey, if we have 10 things and this family over here has 7 or 8 of those 10 things and maybe 2 or 3 that aren't like ours, that's okay. Like that gives us a more realistic comparison and contrast for our kids to say, yeah, it's okay that they believe all these things and they dress a little differently than we do. And you know what? That's okay. Here's why we do it different, but we love them and they, believe the same things we do. And the more that we're broadening that picture, but including more of the foundational truth for our kids to stand on, they have some walking around room. Now they can go over to that friend's house. Now they can maybe stay the night at this family's house because there's a little bit more leash that can be let out. And so for dads who are really living in that overwhelming sense of like, oh my gosh, like don't diminish the truth that you've already invested, if that makes sense.
Oh, it definitely does.
Like we've already taught our kids so much, and at some point now, we take the lock off the fence and we say, okay, like we'll trust the block, or we'll trust the houses next door, or you can like take a look at the house across the street. Like they're doing it pretty well too, and we're teaching our kids now to, for themselves, take in and teaching them to process what's good and what's not. Instead of it always just coming from us, we're teaching them. It's like, the adage of like, you give a man a fish, you feed him, you teach a man to fish and you feed him for life or whatever. Well, when it comes to our kids, it's not just important, Justin, that they know what we believe. They have to know why we believe it so that they can become as unapologetic about conservative values as we are.
Yes.
You know?
No, I agree, and it kind of hints to that what we're getting at. And again, I think it's natural for me. I don't know. It's probably natural for you, and now it wasn't when we were kids to realize that you have to let your kids experience life. You try setting the example, and you also, like I said, benchmarking off of other people. Like, hey, they're not bad people. They just do this different. Or things like that. And I think that's kind of where I think fathers, if you don't know, if you didn't grow up with a dad, or you did grow up with a dad, but he wasn't present, as you said, or if he was a good dad and you're sitting there and you're struggling, maybe the one things as dads can do and also show our kids is like we benchmark other people. And it's not to sit there like, oh, I need to make this person or do that. It's just to like, it could be working for them. What are they doing? Is there a lesson I can learn? Is there something I can apply for this? And it goes back to what I said before, is the thing I love about church is the message, the constant, hey, listen, you can do this better. You're held to this standard. A lot of people don't like to be held to, that's another problem. A lot of people don't like to be held to standards.
Right.
And like with my kids when they were growing up, because different people are dating people and all this other stuff, I used to tell them, I go, when you're in my house, that's your friend, you're not dating them.
Right.
I said, the only example my kids are going to get of what a mom and a dad should be is me and Kerry. Plain and simple. I go, because I don't want my kids getting attached to your girlfriend or boyfriend, and then what happens is a year later, it's someone new, and then 6 months later, it's someone new.
Right.
What I want them to see is what a loving household is like.
Right. Absolutely. And you can't see, and this is I think where people have a tough time, because my wife and I, we don't let the kids do titles, right? We don't go for those things. But at the same time, it's almost at some point negligent to ignore the fact that they clearly have feelings.
Yes.
So we're not going to deny the fact that you show a little bit of a different type of interest in this individual than you do all the other, of that gender in your class. We're not going to pretend like that doesn't exist, but we're going to teach you how, okay, in these years, like you don't need a more than platonic relationship. It's great for you to have an interest in that person, but what does honoring them look like right now? What does respecting them look like right now? And how do you like one thing that we've asked our boys, who both have a little bit of an interest, right? That are forbidden to call them girlfriends.
Yeah.
And what doesn't help is when other kids are calling, there's titles floating around everywhere. But we're just reminding them, and they're pretty good about it. The point is, and a really interesting question is, okay, what do you like about that person? What sparks your interest? Like why that one better than this? And you start to hear things from, turns out young boys aren't that different from old men, right?
Yep.
Well, what they really like is that the girl laughs at their jokes. It's what we all want.
Yep.
And I think that it's really cool though for kids to have a really structured environment, like a really good trellis for that vine to grow on. Instead of just, okay, you have these emotional, like this emotional fruit, if you will. Well, emotional fruit rots when it's on the ground. So let's build this trellis, but let's keep this thing pruned back. We're not letting this run wild. We're going to keep this thing pruned back and controlled, so that we learn how to steward it in this realm, so that we know what to do when it is time for it to grow. And I think that it all comes back to balance. It all comes back to, because I think a big mistake that we can make is to think that because we say, okay, no boyfriends or no girlfriends, that means that our kids are just going to magically not have any feelings for anybody or not take any special interest in somebody until they're what? Where's the threshold? Until you're 21? Until you're 18? Until you're standing at the end of an aisle? And it probably helps too that we're doing counseling with people who were really messed up by purity culture.
Yeah.
Which I've had a hard time wrapping my head around, because I'm like, well, how is that wrong? Like, I thought purity culture was great until you realize, oh no, there was a very like abusive side of that among the conservative community, going back 20, 30 years. And so what we're seeing now is a lot of folks who are deconstructing their faith, their theology, their parents' theology, the church as a whole, and just ethics and values. They're deconstructing it because they were given all the things and none of the whys. They were given all the rules and none of the becauses. And because I said so doesn't work. We've got to be able to teach what does the Lord really say? What's on God's heart for this? Like, what did God make this for? And when we can start to teach our kids to go back to the Father's heart, and by the way, that only happens through their earthly father, right? But when we can teach them to go back to the Father's heart, we're teaching them to seek out the why. Okay, I'm not just going to do this because my parents told me to. I'm going to go do this because they told me to, because it's for what's good. It's for what's best. Because there's a whole laundry list of fallout if I don't. Consequences and, side effects and long-lasting residual, echoes that will last the rest of my life if I don't bring order into who I am right now.
I like what you say, because when I grew up, I'd ask my mother why. Because I said so.
Well, of course.
Right?
That's the easiest thing.
Because I said, and I couldn't stand that. Like, I couldn't stand that.
Oh, it's the worst.
And I said, when I get older, I'm going to be different, right? And I think it's helped me. And as long as my kids approach it, not like just in the challenging mode, because how kids can be like, oh, why do I have to do this or whatever? Because I had one of those a couple of weeks ago, like, why do I have to pay rent?
Yeah.
I'm like, you don't have to. You can just buy your own food, pay for your own electricity. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You don't have to pay rent, right? But I think as parents, that why is actually pretty good, because if people were in that purity culture, I'm assuming, right? And you said it was kind of more like rigid and stuff, where if there was that open discussion, it might also have the parent learn something, right? I always tell my kids this. I say, listen, I don't want you to be a Christian because mom and dad brought you to church. I want you to challenge it. I said, what bugs me is people that won't challenge their faith. I go, that bugs me. I say, because you can challenge me on my faith and I will explain to you why.
Sure.
Right? I said, but it can't be like, well, I just went to church. I went to church and they said this and it kind of makes sense, right? I want to be, I believe it because of this. I believe it because I seen God work in my life. I seen God work in other people's lives.
Yeah.
I seen things happen that you can't explain. I show you stuff. We're sitting there.
Right.
Look at the blessings.
Yeah. So it's not just because I said so. It's because our life reflects God's promises regarding this truth.
Correct.
And I mean, even, okay, that sounds like a broad brushstroke, but even down to something like, okay, taking financial responsibility for, what it costs to live. We're wanting our kids to understand that, like, hey, you are going to be an independent adult one day. You are going to be responsible for all these things. And so it would be really bad parenting on my part. I think I've said that to my kids before. Like, I'd be a terrible father, like, if we just let you off on this, you know? And so I think helping them to see what some of our processes are as we, otherwise just perform our tyrannical duties as parents. It's like, no, this is because I love you. Yeah. I know when I would have to spank our kids, I tried to make it a point to never do it out of anger.
Yes.
Which is not easy, but it's so important. And so even if that means, for me, sometimes the anger would dissipate from the time I say, that's it, you're getting a spanking, from being in the family room with everybody to bringing them upstairs to their room. And by the time I'm to the top of the stairs, now I'm like sitting on the edge of their bed. Okay, you're still going to get the spanking even though I'm not mad, but now you're going to see the spanking and we're going to pray together and I'm going to hug you and I'm going to tell you I love you and how proud I am of you and how this spanking is because I know that you are capable of more. And as a father, it's our job to call out the more.
Yes.
It's our job to draw out of you the more. And so when we can say that prayer with our kids. And I know people are like, well, then you're like associating prayer with punishment, and it's like, no, that's not the only time we pray with our kids. If it was, maybe that would be true, but it's like, now sit in your room and read your Bible for 3 hours. No, I'm not doing that. The idea is, like, when we make mistakes, and even when there's consequences for those mistakes, to then go and bring that before the Lord. I mean, King David did it. He taught us how, right, in the Psalms. And over we see men and women of God sometimes epically failing, but bringing it back to the Lord and saying, God, we need your help. We need your help. Like, Lord, by your Spirit, show us how to do this. Teach us how to be better. Teach us how to show kindness, or be compassionate, or be respectful, or whatever. And what you're teaching there is not just that there is a reactionary response of discipline to whatever you've done wrong, but you're teaching that there's a whole process here of how we take that and turn it into a lesson, a truth that can now be carried with us much longer than the sting on our rear end.
Yes.
You know?
It's funny because, like, I have a bunch of questions here, but it just, like,
Yeah,
be
I'm
more.
sorry.
I'll
let you get back to
it's more organic, and I like this because I'm sitting here listening, and I think sometimes when dads talk or people talk about how they do stuff, you're like, was that working? Was that right? And I think kind of my thing always my kids is, I tell my kids, I'm like, listen, your dad's not the brightest guy in the world, but there's nothing I haven't been able to do. And there's a lot of times I'm like, I don't know if I can do this. I don't, but I go and do it. And I think part of that is to show them that even as a dad, or even as a father, like, there's things that you have to do that you may or may not want and don't know if you can do. There's things that, if you apply yourself. So there's all these lessons, but it comes out of, like, humility. Mm-hmm. And the best thing about it is it's funny, is my kid's like, you don't have humility. You always say, and I said, no. I say, when I accomplish something, I say, see, I could do it.
Right.
But before I did it, what did Dad say? Dad's like, I don't know. And I think it was similar to what you're saying too with the learning process. There is a learning process, right? There is we have to do these things. We have to struggle, and in that struggle, we have to show our kids, like, we struggle too. Mm. But we can be better.
Yeah.
And you're struggling, but you can be better. And I think also to have that example. So it was something you said earlier that made me think about that. And I'm like, no, I think just being honest, I think being who you are and showing that as a dad, I'm not perfect, even though I have a shirt that says, "No, if nobody's perfect." My wife got it for me. I guess I'm nobody. Right? But
that's great.
But if you talk to Carrie, she'd be like, no, like, he is a humble person, hardworking. But when he's right, you better make sure, like, he knows he's right. So don't challenge Dad when he knows he's right. But a lot of other things he's not. So I think that's one thing I would hope for a lot of people to understand is you're not going to get everything right. And what you said earlier, I'm sure some people are like, oh, I spanked my kids. Right? Like, there's different tools, there's different things, and everyone's in a different place, and you have to,
There's always kids that you got, like you said earlier, something key, and that is that when you have more than one kid, it's more than one kid, and they're wired very differently. Some kids require a lot more, a lot stricter, a lot more consistent. Some kids, they just figure it out the first time. And you never have to do. It's like,
that's my youngest.
Yeah. So I think it does require. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. Listen, that's good.
But it's true, and I think to me it's like I can't buy the whole, like, I love my kids too much to do that. No, you don't. Yeah. No, you don't. Yeah. I love my kids too much not to.
Thank you. Thank you. We talked earlier, and Carrie's going to be a little upset, but. That's why I told her, I said, if we're going to have the rules, it's going to be our rules, it's going to be our punishment. And I think a lot of times dads assume that punishment role, right? And again, I think there's a reason for it. I think we're able to put aside some of that feeling, some of that hurt, because there is a lot of hurt to punish your kids and not to provide everything. But if you don't, it's going to be worse.
Yeah.
And I think that's always the struggle. And it's funny, when I was talking to the other guys, A couple of the grandparents, the grandfathers talked about that. Just that hurt, just when they did all this stuff, they raised their kids and their kids were leaving and they like cried like babies and stuff. And I said, this is one of the things I think a lot of people look at dads and fathers are like, they're these tough guys, they're not too emotional, they do this. And like, I think we suppress a lot of that stuff. Maybe not everyone, I guess everyone's different, a lot of guys are different. I think a lot of guys suppress that. And, now that my daughter went to college, I tell everyone she pissed me off the day we dropped her off, so I didn't cry, but I cried a lot before. I replaced one emotion with another,
There
right?
you go. Yeah.
So I thanked her because I had to drive home. So it actually probably worked out pretty well. So God knew what he was doing.
That's awesome.
But for weeks before, I cried. And now my sons are getting to that age, and you cry and you pray, and because you want the best for them and you want God to help them achieve the people that they are, whatever. So I guess that would lead me to another question. What do you want your children to learn from you? Like if you had one thing, if you could be like, hey, God, please leave them with this. Please leave them with at least being this or whatever. What would it?
I feel like, and I don't know if this comes from just seeing like the dearth of it, because I have to pick one thing.
One I know, right?
And it's not because I think, oh, I'm just like crushing it. If they can just be just like me.
Yeah.
I mean, part of my prayer is, Lord, like from the time they were little was to pray that they don't make those same mistakes I made. But I feel like we on a shallow note, I'd say we live in a world where like there is like a famine of work ethic. And so I just don't know what I would do with myself if my kids grow up to be lazy or just, gamers or like no motivation to provide or to work. I mean, that I don't know what I could do with that. But I look at them now and I already feel like pretty good about the work ethic piece. No, I think on a deep eternal level, I need them to just like fall in love with the Lord.
Yeah.
They have to have that relationship. It can't be mine. Pastors' kids are like notorious for like, going to jail or whatever. Fill in the blank. Yeah. Being obnoxious from the time they're little. They're like they terrorize everybody, and we'll save that for another episode because that's terrible. But my prayer is just that they develop their own relationship with the Lord, that they carry out, that they discover Him for themselves, and that they invest into that relationship themselves. That they don't just go to church because mom and dad drag them, but that they realize the value of it. Now, as a kid, we like always went to church, and I know that part of the value that I have on it today is because my mom and stepdad, like, unless you're on your deathbed, you're at church. Mm-hmm. We plan vacations around, it was like this was a huge priority. And so I don't want my kids to believe in prioritizing, extracurriculars or sports or anything like that above church. But at the same time, it needs to be them that finds the value in it. Mm-hmm. It can't just be because mom and dad do. And so at some point, there's that threshold, that gray area where you have to be able to pass the baton. And I guess that's the number one thing is somehow I got a hold of that baton. And I think it's because I started to foster that relationship myself. I started to pray. I started to mean it when I sang songs. I worship songs. I started to go after the Lord in His Word and really try to understand, what is on the Father's heart when this was written. This isn't just a textbook. This is a love letter, Mm-hmm. And so I'm praying that my kids find that.
So it's funny because if I would have been asked, I would have said to stand up and be strong, especially in the face of everything. But as you talked, right, I think anything that I would say that I want my kids to learn from me would probably have to come from God, from knowing God and having a good relationship.
Well, that's where your strength comes from. When you say stand up, be strong, don't cave. Like that's the Lord in us.
Yes. Be kind, be nice, serve others. Like all those things that you would want from your kids, I could teach some things, right? I could say, oh, we do this or we do this, kind of like you said, your family took you. But until they understand the reason behind it and they're doing it out of love and they're doing it because they have a relationship with God, like I said, I think a lot of it would just because, well, I was brought up this way. But I think the more you have that relationship, I think the easier it is. Like I said, I think a lot of people struggle with how religious they are, or they could always do more and stuff like that. And I've been there, but like I said, when we've had those discussions where, like, I have that peace, right? When my wife is getting up to be fired, and I'm sitting there, and there's 3 teachers, 2 of them that go here. There's 3 teachers, and this lawyer shows up out of the blue, first time meeting him that night, and all I could think about is the 3 guys that were thrown in the fire, and then Jesus was with them.
Yeah.
And right then I said, listen, there's that peace.
Yeah.
And from there on, I had peace. Like, we didn't have jobs for months. And I said, you know what? I said, we were picked to do this. And the other thing, too, is you sit there and you're like, hey, I try, there's examples and everything or whatever. So I said, listen, I go, I just want you to know, we're not going to get into it too much. I go, but your parents nothing's changed for you.
Right.
I go, everything in the world is going crazy and nothing has changed for you.
Right. It's huge.
But it's also, that's because we had a peace, right? The peace that passes all understanding. And I'm like, that is my prayer. My prayer is, if it gets bad, that my kids said, hey, listen, no matter what, I got God on my side. That's all that matters. So, I guess I know I'm taking up so much of your time. We could talk for hours. I love it.
Right? I know.
All right, so
it's true.
Just wrapping up again.
Yeah.
Right. When you asked that question, like, do you think America would be a better place? And everyone's like, oh yeah, I think it would be. But then we talk about fatherhood. You know, our learning, our mistakes, our things we want to do better, the importance, the kids, how those kids are going to affect society in the future, what can they do, what can we do. I think the question is, like, how do we, and again, I don't know if this is for you particularly, because in your capacity, what you do now, I think you affect so many people, men and women. You're an example or whatever. But I guess for people who might watch this or whatever, like, how do they do or be a better dad to help, if maybe not change the tide, to slow it down or stop it so their kids can have a little bit better life or be resilient or face what's coming?
Yeah. It's a great question. And I think from 100,000 feet, Justin, I would say so much of it comes back to order. We all love our kids. I mean, I don't really know what your market is here, but I would say, based on knowing you and who your heart is for, I think by and large, far and away, you ask any dad and they're gonna love their kids. The thing is never been, do you love them? The thing is, okay, will you feed them? Because even when Jesus is asking Peter, right, he says, do you love me, right? 3 times. And Peter says, yes, of course I love you. I love you, Lord, I love you. But Jesus had a love language, and it was to take care of the sheep, tend the sheep, feed the lambs, feed the sheep. And I think that for us, we have to introduce our love to order. And when we can bring order into the equation, it creates a world where our kids can actually receive the love that we have for them. Because otherwise, our love can be very fruitless at times. You know, our love can be almost like counterproductive. You know, not almost, just downright counterproductive without order. And so I feel like from 100,000 foot view, it's order. Now, that can seem like an insurmountable task to a father who's saying, hey, I got to just get one thing right. Like, can you help me get one thing right? Because I got 100, just pick one and help me get it right. I would say start today. Start today and start small. Just what's the next thing? Where's the next area of chaos that you can confront with order? and then ask the Lord to help you. And guess what? The Holy Spirit is invested in our fatherhood. It's not just a like, hey, the Holy Spirit comes along to help us out with this covenant of marriage. No, the Holy Spirit is invested in us raising our kids well, raising a generation well, reproducing a culture of grace and life and redemption well. So don't underestimate that, and don't be overwhelmed or feel insecure or inadequate. Guess what? We are insecure and we are inadequate, but we serve a God that is imparting himself as a father. Like, we get to share in his title as father. You know what I'm saying? And he's imparting to us the power to do this supernaturally well. Good. Not just like, hey, I'm like that epic TV dad that's like cool and does it right, but like is also raising good kids. No, this goes way beyond that. This is like, we are literally performing signs and wonders as just being decent fathers who are raising our kids in the Word and not compromising and unapologetically biblical in our worldview. And so again, I would say don't be overwhelmed to dads who are trying to get it right, and make sure that your child knows your heart. That's where so many people went wrong with God. That's how we ended up with Pharisees crucifying the Messiah in the New Testament, is people who knew the law but didn't know the heart. And I think we can raise kids who are really aware of our law, but who maybe totally missed our heart. And so I want my heart to be more important than my law. Our law is important, yes, by the way. And the law is really good. Even 1 Timothy, the first chapter, talks about how the law is still good in a place where we're missing the Spirit, where we don't have the Father's heart. It's still good to build parameters around us and have rules, Yes. I think it was in a sermon a while back, and one of our points was free men still follow rules. Freedom doesn't mean without rules. It means free because we're walking within those parameters. And so I think that for guys today, make sure that your kids know your heart. It's not just the rule, but why. Does that make sense?
No, it does. And like I have this saying on my show, I always tell people, do something. And I think a lot of times when you tell people to do something, we are all programmed, I believe, to think doing something means something grandiose, something big. And you kind of hinted to it. It's just maybe even seeing something small.
Sure.
Start somewhere.
Yeah.
Right? I always tell my kids, there's that song from, I think it was like Rudolph or one of those Rudolphs or Saint Nick or whatever. And the guy's like, put one foot in front of the other, right? And we sing that because if all you do is you do something and you do it consistently with a good heart and with your eyes on the Lord, you're going to get to a place that you're supposed to be. Yeah. But I think a lot of times we're stuck. We're stuck because we're afraid to make mistakes.
Sure.
Where we don't know what to do, so we're paralyzed. And I think the thing would be is do something, whatever that something is, and with a good heart. Yeah. And with your eyes on the Lord and eyes on the kids to raise them the way they should go. Right. Yeah. That's the thing. And again, I appreciate you taking the time, because I think a lot of people struggle with a lot of this stuff. So hearing from you, a pastor of a church, who has a lot of eyes on you, and you also have your kids' eyes on you, and that's a huge responsibility, because not only is it your children you're bringing up, and I'm not going to say these adults are children, but you're setting an example for your kids and the congregation, and everywhere you go you're an example. So the weight of that, and I don't know if you have the weight, because you might be like me, like this is what I was meant to do. Yeah. Right? And to me it's more of a blessing than a weight. So, I appreciate your insights. They were wonderful. Like I said, we could probably talk for hours on this or whatever. And I hope we have these discussions in the future. And I hope what happens is, one of my ideas out of this whole thing is maybe if someone stumbles upon a video and hears something you say, or hears something one of those other people say, and like, that's right, I need to make a change, that's worth it. Sure. But I think also sometimes those things are the personal conversations that we have to have with other men, with my wife. I have to have these conversations with our friends when they're sitting there and you're like, hey, probably shouldn't say that to your kids, or if you don't want to do that, say, hey, listen, I'm going to show my side of a father around my kids' friends or whatever, so they get to see some things that they might not experience or whatever. So I think we all have a part to play. I think we all have to realize that, and my hope is, in years down the road, there'll be more active fathers, more fathers willing to do the right things, and I think society will be a little better. I'm hoping. I'm always optimistic. I think there's going to be a revival. I think there's a lot of people looking for answers.
Amen.
I think they're looking for answers, and we got to give them the right answers, and we got to show it. And it's not like we're right because we're right. It's be humble. Like, this is what I learned. You're gonna mess up. You're not gonna do everything right. But we had a God that forgave us for messing up. We can do that. It's just doing something. So I appreciate it, Pastor Zac.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate everything, and I'm going to do this again probably sometime.
Awesome.
So
Let's do it. All right. God bless you.
God bless you too. Thank you so much.